When I was 16, my friends and I decided to go camping in a wooded area near my hometown. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing in the forest that people used sometimes. The kind of place where you made your own fire ring with stones and prayed it wouldn't rain. There were 4 of us: me, my buddy Darren, his cousin Alex, and Alex's girlfriend Lila. We hiked in with our gear just before sunset and got the fire going by the time it was dark. The woods were alive with sound: crickets, frogs, the occasional distant coyote. But once the flames started crackling, it felt safe. After a while, Darren suggested we tell scary stories. None of us had planned anything, so we mostly made up dumb ghost tales on the spot. We laughed more than we got scared. Then, somewhere between Alex's bad, haunted lumberjack story and my attempt at a creepy hitchhiker one, we all went silent at the same time, because someone else laughed. It wasn't any of us. It came from the trees, maybe 20 feet away, just out of the glow of the firelight. At first I thought it was an echo, like maybe our laughter had bounced off something weird. But the tone was wrong. It wasn't 4 voices overlapping. It was one, sharp and high, mocking. Lila clutched Alex's arm. "Did you guys hear that?" We all nodded. "Probably just someone hiking," Darren said, though his voice cracked. "Another group out here." We waited, expecting to hear footsteps, voices, or maybe see flashlights cutting through the trees. Nothing. Just the fire, the frogs, the occasional wind. So we tried to laugh it off. We kept talking, though our stories turned more into nervous chatter than actual tales. About 10 minutes later, it happened again. This time, it was my own voice. Clear as if someone had recorded me earlier and played it back, I heard myself saying the line from my dumb ghost story. And when they turned around, the hitchhiker was gone. The words floated out from the woods louder than before, sharp and mocking again. My stomach dropped. Everyone turned toward me like I had a tape recorder hidden in my backpack. I swear on my life, I hadn't done anything. "That's not funny," Lila whispered. "I didn't—" But Darren cut me off. "Hello?" He called out into the trees. His voice shook. "Who's out there?" Silence. Then after a few seconds, we heard him again. His exact words thrown back at us. "Hello? Who's out there?" Same tone, same nervous tremble, only this time the voice didn't echo from where he'd spoken. It came from the opposite side of the clearing. Lila started crying quietly. Alex put an arm around her, his face pale. I wanted to pack up right then and there, but Darren insisted it was some local kids messing with us. He stood, grabbed a flashlight, and shined it toward the trees. Nothing but rain-damp bark and shadows. Then the voice came again. Not mocking this time. Not repeating. "Cold out here." It was close. Too close, like the speaker was standing just outside the firelight. The hair on my arms stood straight up. We didn't argue after that. We packed up fast, kicking dirt over the fire, stuffing gear into our bags any way it would fit. I kept sweeping the flashlight across the trees, half expecting to see a face peering back at us. On the hike out, it followed. Not footsteps, never footsteps, just words. Snippets of things we had said that night. A laugh here, a phrase there. Once it even copied Lila's sobs, echoing them back with a hollow cruelty that made my skin crawl. We reached Darren's truck and piled in, slamming the doors. None of us said anything until we were halfway back to town. That's when Lila broke the silence. "Did you guys notice? It never used Alex's voice." We all went quiet again. She was right. Out of everything we had heard, my story, Darren's shouts, Lila's crying, it had never once repeated Alex. We looked at him. He stared straight ahead, gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles were white. His face was expressionless, like he was forcing himself not to react. "Alex?" I asked carefully. "You okay?" He nodded, but he didn't look at me. His eyes stayed locked on the road. "Fine." The rest of the drive, he didn't speak. We never went camping together again. Darren moved away for college. Lila broke up with Alex a month later. I don't talk to either of them anymore. But sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I think about that night. About how it copied all of us except him. And I wonder, was it ignoring him? Or was it already using his voice, and we just didn't realize it?
It was late October when Aaron, his cousin Daniel, and their two friends set up camp deep in the woods of northern Michigan. The air was sharp with the smell of pine, and the only sounds were the crackle of their fire and the occasional rustle of leaves overhead. They were telling jokes and roasting marshmallows when Daniel suddenly froze mid-sentence. "Do you guys see that?" he whispered. Aaron followed his gaze. About 30 feet away, through the black curtain of trees, a dim yellow light flickered, faint but unmistakable. It swayed slowly, like a lantern being carried by someone walking. At first they laughed it off, maybe another group of campers nearby. But then Daniel reminded them they hadn't passed a single tent, RV, or sign of anyone for miles. The ranger had even told them earlier that the campsite was practically empty this time of year. The light kept moving, weaving between the trees, closer then further, almost circling their campsite. Aaron's stomach dropped when he realized it wasn't random. It felt like whoever was holding it was pacing, watching. Trying to act brave, Aaron called out, "Hello? Anyone out there?" The lantern froze. The swaying stopped. For a few seconds, the forest was dead silent. No crickets, no wind, just the soft pop of their fire. Then, slowly, the light swung upward, as if whoever carried it had tilted it toward them. That was enough to set everyone on edge. They doused the fire halfway, killing the glow, hoping the darkness might make them harder to see. But the lantern stayed, hanging unnaturally still among the trees. And then, with a snap, like someone crushing twigs underfoot, it went out. Darkness swallowed the forest. The group huddled in the tent, whispering nervously, waiting for hours. Around 3 a.m., Aaron finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. He woke again when something tapped against the canvas. Once, twice, then again, deliberately, like fingers drumming. Daniel muttered that it was probably an animal, but Aaron wasn't convinced. The taps weren't random. They came in sets of 3. By dawn, the forest seemed normal again. When they stepped outside, relieved, Aaron noticed something chilling. Right at the tree line, where the lantern had first appeared, stood a dead oak. On its lowest branch, dangling on a short piece of rope, was an old metal lantern. Its glass was cracked, its flame chamber empty. None of them had the courage to touch it. They packed up in silence and left the forest that morning.
Aaron swears the thing that disturbed him most wasn't the lantern itself, but the ground beneath it. In the soft dirt circling their entire campsite were clear footprints, barefoot, large, and fresh.
It was the summer after graduation, when Mia, her brother Tyler, and 3 of their friends decided to celebrate with a camping trip in the Appalachian woods. They hiked all day, finally settling near a small clearing where the tree line curved into a half circle around their fire pit. That first night was uneventful. They cooked hot dogs, laughed, and told embarrassing high school stories. But on the second night, while the fire burned low, they heard it, a whistle. At first, it was faint, almost blending with the sound of wind through the leaves, a slow, tuneless whistle, like someone trying to remember a melody, but never quite getting it right. Probably another camper, Tyler said, but his voice wasn't convincing. They hadn't seen another soul since leaving the trail. The whistling came again, closer this time, from just beyond the firelight. It wasn't random either. 3 notes, always the same 3 notes, repeated like a signal. Mia grabbed a flashlight and swept it across the woods. Nothing. Just black trees stretching into endless dark. But the second she turned it off, the whistling started again, even closer. Her friend Jordan yelled out, "Hey, whoever you are, it's not funny." The forest went silent. For a moment, they all relaxed, thinking it had stopped. Then the whistling picked up again, this time from the opposite side of the clearing. It went on for hours, circling them, stopping whenever they shone a light, starting again as soon as they put it down. By the time they crawled into their tents, no one was laughing. Sometime in the night, Mia awoke to the sound of whispering. She held her breath, listening. It wasn't from inside the tent. It was right outside. And then, faintly, the whistle again. 3 notes, slow, mocking. She shook Tyler awake, and they lay frozen until morning. When sunlight finally hit, the forest was eerily normal. No footprints, no sign of anyone ever being there. But as they packed up to leave, Mia noticed something carved in the bark of a tree just behind where she had slept. It was a crude figure of a man, long legs, wide mouth, and beside it, 3 simple music notes scratched deep into the wood. The group cut the trip short, hiking back to the car in near silence. To this day, Mia says she never listens to whistling the same way again.
Lena had always loved camping by water. There was something calming about it, the way ripples shimmered in moonlight, the way sound carried softly across the surface. When her boyfriend Chris suggested they celebrate their anniversary with a weekend trip, she picked a remote lake she'd read about online. The article had described it as untouched wilderness, a place where few people bothered to go because of the long hike. That to Lena, sounded perfect. The trail was tough. They carried heavy packs through winding forest paths for hours, climbing over fallen logs and squeezing between rocks slick with moss. But when they finally arrived, their exhaustion melted into awe. The lake stretched out like a sheet of glass, black and still under the setting sun. Pine trees crowded its edges, their reflections crisp on the surface. The air was cool, damp with the scent of wet earth. And most striking of all, silence. Not a single motorboat, no distant chatter, no music from nearby campsites. Just stillness. They set up their tent near the water's edge, lit a small fire, and cooked a simple dinner. For a while, they just sat together, watching the flames pop and dance, comforted by the sense of isolation. It was during one of those quiet stretches that they heard it. "Hello?" Both of them turned, startled. The voice was faint, distant, drifting across the water. Chris frowned. "Did you hear that?" Lena nodded. She scanned the opposite shoreline but saw only a wall of trees. No flashlights, no figures, no boats. "Probably a fisherman," Chris said, though it was late for that. Lena hesitated, then called back, "Hello?" Her voice echoed across the water. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, almost instantly, the reply came again. "Hello?" Same tone, same word. Chris forced a laugh. "Echo, has to be." But Lena knew what an echo sounded like, and this hadn't been one. It was too clear, too deliberate. They stayed up later than usual that night, both uneasy but unwilling to admit it. Eventually, exhaustion won, and they crawled into their tent. The sound of water lapping gently at the shore lulled them to sleep. Lena awoke with a start sometime after midnight. The fire had burned down to ash, and the only light came from the moon reflected on the lake. She sat up, trying to figure out what had stirred her. Then she heard it again. "Hello?" But this time it wasn't across the lake. It was right outside the tent. Her breath caught in her throat. She gripped Chris's arm, shaking him awake. He sat up groggily until he heard it too. The same calm, casual tone, as though someone stood just feet away. Chris mouthed, "Don't move." They stayed frozen, listening. The voice didn't shout, didn't demand. It simply repeated, soft and measured. "Hello? Hello?" Chris finally grabbed the flashlight. With one swift motion, he unzipped the tent flap and shone the beam into the night. Nothing. The shoreline was empty. The trees stood still. Not a single ripple disturbed the surface of the water. And yet, Lena could swear she'd felt breath against the canvas a moment before. They barely slept after that. Every crack of a twig, every shift of wind made them jump. The next day they tried to laugh it off. Maybe another camper had wandered nearby. Maybe they were overtired and had imagined things. But when Lena suggested packing up early, Chris shook his head. "We're fine. It's just the woods playing tricks." By evening, they tried to relax again, sitting by the fire, roasting marshmallows, staring into the dark water. That was when the voice returned. This time, it didn't call from across the lake. It came from deep in the forest behind them. "Hello?" Both of them spun, Chris raising the flashlight, but again, no one. The trees pressed in, black and endless. Lena's hands shook. "Chris, it's not an echo. It's not..." Before she could finish, the voice interrupted.
Hello? Lena? Her stomach dropped. Her name. It had said her name. Chris swore under his breath, grabbed her hand, and pulled her toward the tent. They barricaded themselves inside, clutching each other in silence, barely breathing. All night, the voice came and went, circling the campsite. Sometimes it was near, almost whispering against the canvas. Other times it drifted back across the water. Always the same casual tone, always patient, as if waiting for them to answer. By morning, they were pale and hollow-eyed. Neither spoke much as they stuffed their gear into their packs. Chris refused to admit how shaken he was, but Lena could tell by the way his hands trembled. She went to the lake to fill their bottles one last time. That's when she saw them. Footprints. Dozens of them, pressed deep into the mud. Not boot prints, not sneakers, bare feet. They circled the campsite, overlapping in strange, looping patterns, as though someone had walked in endless rings around them all night. But the detail that made her chest tighten in dread was this. Each footprint had 6 toes. She didn't tell Chris. She just grabbed her bag and insisted they leave. The hike back felt longer, heavier, as though something pressed at their backs the whole way. They didn't speak of the voice, not on the trail, not in the car, not for weeks after. But sometimes Lena still wakes in the night to silence, listening, holding her breath. And every so often, when the house is very quiet, she swears she hears it again, soft, patient, just beyond the walls. Hello?
Ethan had been camping since he was a kid, but this was his first solo trip. He wanted quiet, no phones, no people, just him, the woods, and the fire. He hiked miles off trail in Colorado, eventually finding a spot where a few logs had clearly been used as makeshift seats. It was perfect. By dusk, the fire was roaring, and he sat with a mug of coffee, staring into the flames. The woods around him felt alive, but calm, the occasional snap of a branch, the rustle of wind in the pines. Then he heard it. A laugh. Soft, light, like a child's giggle. Ethan whipped his head around. Nothing, just the trees swaying. He told himself it was an animal, maybe even the wind, and tried to shake it off. But when the fire burned low, he heard it again. This time it was closer. "Hello?" he called, voice tight. No answer. By midnight, the laughter had stopped. Relieved, he crawled into his sleeping bag, letting the embers glow outside the tent flap. He woke hours later to the sharp crack of wood snapping. He froze, listening. The fire had gone out, but faint light flickered against the tent walls. He slowly unzipped the flap. A fire was burning again in the pit, and across from it, sitting on one of the logs, was a girl. Her back was to him, hair dark and tangled, dress torn and dirty. She sat perfectly still, facing the flames, her hands resting in her lap. "Hey," he called. "Are you okay?" The girl didn't move. He stepped out slowly, keeping his flashlight on her. "Do you need help?" Nothing. When he got within 10 feet, she finally tilted her head, not turning, not rising, just tilting, as though acknowledging him.
Her neck bent too far, unnaturally, until he could almost see her face in profile. Her skin was pale, sagging. Ethan's body locked up with fear. "Look, I'll call someone," he stammered. And then she laughed, the same soft, childlike giggle he'd heard earlier. It came from deep in her throat, warped and wet. He backed toward the tent, his light shaking. The girl didn't rise, didn't move, just kept laughing into the flames. Finally, he grabbed his pack, abandoning half his gear, and sprinted through the woods until his legs nearly gave out. He hiked in darkness until dawn broke. When he finally made it back to the ranger station, exhausted and shaking, he tried to explain. The ranger listened quietly, then sighed. "You're not the first," he said. "People talk about a girl out there, shows up by their fire. She doesn't follow if you leave quick, but don't stick around. Some who do, well..." He didn't finish the sentence. Ethan never camped alone again, and every time he hears a giggle in a crowded place, even from a child, his chest tightens with that same old dread.
It was the last night of the camping trip. The group had already swapped every scary story they could think of, and the fire was burning low, embers glowing a deep orange. Nobody wanted to admit it, but there was a heavy silence hanging over the campsite, the kind that made the woods feel too alive. One of the campers, a guy named Eric, poked at the fire with a stick and asked, "Has anyone ever told you about the fire that never dies?" The others laughed nervously, thinking it was just another story, but Eric's face stayed serious. He explained that deep in these woods there had been an old family that lived off the land. One winter, a fire broke out in their cabin, trapping them inside. Locals claimed that when they rebuilt the site, the fire always seemed to return, flames flickering in the ashes no matter how many times the pit was doused with water or snow. "They say the fire is alive," Eric whispered, his voice almost drowned by the crackling wood. "And if you stare at the embers long enough, you'll see faces, faces of the ones who burned." A cold gust swept through the campsite, and the fire flared unnaturally high for a moment, as if answering him. The campers froze, eyes wide. When the flames died back down, the logs shifted, and in the glowing ash, faint outlines seemed to appear, shapes that looked like hollow eyes and twisted mouths. One of the girls screamed and threw dirt onto the fire, but the faces didn't vanish. Instead, the flames bent and coiled into a single burning figure rising from the pit. Its voice was like the hiss of smoke. "Stay with us in the fire." Panic erupted. They scattered, some grabbing their bags, others bolting straight into the woods. But no matter how far they ran, every glance back showed the glow of flames trailing them, flickering between the trees. The next morning, rangers found their campsite abandoned. The fire pit was still smoking, though nobody had been there to tend it. And in the ashes, there were 7 sets of footprints burned into the earth, circling the fire, then stopping. To this day, hikers say if you light a campfire in that forest, The embers will sometimes shift on their own, arranging themselves into footprints, waiting for new ones to join them.
It was late October when Daniel and his 3 college friends, Maya, Chris, and Elena, decided to camp deep inside the state forest. They weren't the type who went outdoors often, but they'd all been overwhelmed by exams, relationships, and jobs. A weekend with no cell service, just firelight and quiet, sounded like the perfect escape. They found a clearing surrounded by tall pines. The ground was littered with needles, and the smell of damp wood lingered in the air. As dusk fell, they built a fire, and Daniel noticed how the flames cast sharp shadows into the trees, making the woods look alive. They laughed, roasted marshmallows, and passed a flask around. Hours slipped by. The night was pitch black, the fire their only source of light. That's when Chris said he heard something, soft crunching footsteps coming from the tree line. Everyone froze. Daniel strained his ears but heard nothing except the occasional pop of the fire. "Probably a deer," he said, trying to keep the mood light. They brushed it off. But then, not long after, a voice called out from the woods. "Mind if I join your fire?" The 4 of them stared at one another. It was a man's voice, calm, deep, and close, too close. Chris grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the direction of the voice. Nothing, just rows of trees. "Who's there?" he shouted. The voice answered again, this time from a slightly different angle. "I said, mind if I join?" A shiver ran down Daniel's spine. Something was off. Whoever it was hadn't stepped into the firelight, even though they had plenty of chance to. Maya whispered, "Maybe it's a hiker." But Elena shook her head. "At night? Out here? Alone?" Chris called out again, "If you need help, come closer so we can see you." Silence. The fire crackled. Daniel's pulse quickened. Then the voice returned, only softer, as if mocking them. "Mind if I join your fire?" This time the words didn't come from the woods. They came directly behind Daniel's ear. He spun around, nearly falling into the flames. Nothing was there. His friends were wide-eyed, pale, clearly having heard it too. "Okay," Maya said, grabbing her backpack. "We're leaving, now." But Chris was stubborn. "It's probably just someone screwing with us. Don't panic." Before they could argue, a figure finally appeared at the tree line. A man, tall, dressed in what looked like a heavy coat. His face, though, was oddly hard to focus on. In the flicker of the fire, it almost seemed blurred, as if the flames couldn't illuminate him properly. He stood just at the edge of the light and repeated, in the exact same tone as before, "Mind if I join your fire?" Daniel's mouth dried. It wasn't a question, it was a recording, a perfect copy of itself, every time. Elena panicked, threw a log onto the fire to make it blaze higher. For a split second, the figure vanished, not walked away, just disappeared, as if he'd never been there. The woods fell silent again. No crickets, no wind, just their ragged breathing. They didn't even bother packing up. They grabbed their bags and sprinted down the trail with flashlights shaking. The shadows seemed to chase them, swallowing the light. Every so often, Daniel swore he heard the same voice whispering from different angles along the path.
Mind if I join your fire? When they finally reached the parking lot, gasping and drenched in sweat, the forest behind them looked normal again. Dark, quiet, empty. They piled into Chris's car and slammed the doors, locking them. Chris tried to start the engine, but it coughed and stalled. He cursed and tried again. The headlights flickered on for a moment, illuminating the tree line near the lot. The man was standing there, same coat, same impossible face. The headlights flickered off. When they came back on, he was gone. Chris finally got the car running, and they sped out of the lot, gravel flying behind them. No one spoke for miles. Weeks later, back on campus, Daniel tried to find logical explanations. A prank, stress, maybe something they imagined. But one night, while studying alone, he felt warm air brush against his ear, and a voice whispered, "Mind if I join your fire?"